It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat, talkRADIO host Julia Hartley-Brewer, the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesman Alyn Smith MP and the former Labour MP Caroline Flint. Today, we still don't know for certain who's been elected US President. In Michigan, calls from these Trump supporters to stop counting. But in Arizona, these Trump supporters are angry. The result there has been called too soon for Biden. England goes into lockdown. We're told for a month, but the Chancellor says the new furlough scheme will be in place until March. This businessman will be listening. Will there be any help for his devastated firm?
She is a fully qualified nurse who is wishing to care for her own mother.
Arrested for taking her mother from a care home after months apart. Will new COVID guidance help desperate families see their relatives? Let's start with the news as England has gone into a month-long lockdown that the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has been expected to say that the furlough scheme will last until March. My question to the guests to start the programme, starting with you, Tom, is does that mean that lockdown could also extend until March?
No, I think the debate yesterday made it pretty clear that the government would find that very difficult to pass, and this is merely to give stability to businesses to know that they have a cushion until March.
Julia?
Well, the legislation, of course, automatically falls on the 2nd of December, but I have to say it's a little bit worrying because this implies that we're going to head straight out of lockdown into Tier 3, where a lot of the businesses would currently be eligible for the furlough scheme would once again see themselves closed down. I think it's a very worrying sign indeed. I don't think it's going to give any business people any comfort.
Caroline, how do you see it?
I don't think they want to stay in lockdown beyond 2nd of December. We were already in Tier 3 before the national lockdown anyway. What I don't see is the evidence of how we're going to come out of this, and the government saying what determines us going into or coming out of lockdown. And I think that just creates more uncertainty.
Right. The lockdown's in England, Alyn, but how do you view this from the Chancellor, that furlough, the financial scheme of support, will go on until March?
Well, I'm afraid with this Chancellor, we've learned to hold our applause until we see the detail of the scheme, and I think there's a lot of detail that's yet to come out. We've been calling for financial support for long enough, as has Northern England, as has Wales. It's telling that it's only now that lockdown is hitting the southeast of England that we're seeing a serious attention of this. But it sounds positive in terms of more business support, so that's good. But we do need to be thinking about freelancers, creatives, the Forgotten Limited, company directors as well. There's been a lot of people excluded from these support schemes, so we need to see a comprehensive package.
All right, we're going to go back to the whole issue of lockdown and furlough later on in the programme. But first of all, let's bring everyone up to date in terms of the latest on the US presidential election. As we've gone on air, there's still no clear result. It looks as if Joe Biden is edging towards the magic number of 270 votes in the Electoral College and then would become the next US president. Who better to ask than our expert, Andrew Neil. Andrew, take us through it.
Well, if you include Wisconsin, which has been projected for Joe Biden, he's up now at 253 electoral college votes. The magic number is 270. If Georgia goes his way too, and it's very close, but he's edging ahead there too, that would take him up to 269, and he'd be one away. And there are, for complicated reasons I won't go into, there are one or two extras there that would take him over the 270. But it's going to be slow, and here's why, Joe. Mr. Biden has won in Wisconsin, but the margin of victory is under 1%. If he does take Georgia, it'll be under 1% there too. That means the Republicans can legitimately demand a recount. And I think that'll make Joe Biden reluctant to declare victory until these recounts have taken place. So I doubt it's going to happen today.
Now, in terms of the panel's response, I want to start, Tom, with you. The government so far has been reluctant to step into what they see as an election going on in the United States. But with those comments yesterday from Donald Trump saying that the election is a fraud, that votes should stop being counted in certain states, was that a robust enough response from the UK government when some see democracies at threat?
So I think the American people are the people who should be deciding this election. I think it should be deciding it in the ballot box. And I'm very glad that Republican senators like Mitch McConnell have said, keep counting. Absolutely keep counting. So this is something we've been used to, I'm afraid, from President Trump at various points.
And the UK response?
Well, I'm not sure it's for the UK to get involved so long as the American system is working. And the American system is working. The Senate is speaking out, the House is speaking out, and the judges, if they're needed, we hope they're not, but if they are needed, they're there.
Right, Alyn, how do you see it?
Well, this underlines our concern about President Trump. He's been playing this loser's narrative, undermining trust in the institutions, undermining trust in the concept of US democracy. And some of his people have taken that symbolism, and America is an angry place at the moment. And we hope that the US, and I agree with Tom that it is fundamentally for the people of the US to decide who their president is, and we should all keep a wee bit of distance from that. But that's why I would far rather see a Biden White House than a Trump White House going forward.
Julia?
Yeah, there's no question at all that what he's saying is outrageous. Donald Trump hasn't produced any evidence. The key thing is I'm not entirely sure why Dominic Raab or Boris Johnson should be getting involved at this stage. I think that's inappropriate. I think we would be rightly irritated here in Britain. Last time an American president tried to get involved with our politics, we got very cross about it. I do think it's fascinating, though, how many people, I mean, I'm no Trump fan at all, but how many people are outraged by Donald Trump trying to undermine a public vote? Because I seem to recall people like Alan Smith and many others spending 4 years trying to undermine a public vote here for Brexit here in Britain. So I think it's a bit darn rich of people like Alan Smith to say what he's saying this morning.
Alyn?
That's flatly untrue. I was clear from throughout that I respected the Remain vote in Scotland because we voted Remain 62%. Now, that created a democratic conundrum, which I dug in harder to try and fix rather than sit in the sidelines being a pundit.
Right. Caroline, though, do you think, when it goes back to the US, do you think that democracy is being threatened and therefore the UK government does have a role to be more robust than the Foreign Secretary was yesterday following those remarks?
No, I think we should just keep calm at this present time. Look, Trump had a narrative from before even, people were turning up to vote, even before people started registering for their postal votes, which was to set a shadow over this election in case he lost. And I hope Biden wins. Look, there's a lot of counting still to be done. I don't believe, unless there's serious law breaking in the states, and all these states have slightly different variations of how they do their elections, that Trump has got a leg to stand on. What he's trying to do here is, if he loses to Biden, is create the narrative for going forward over the next 4 years to say he was robbed. So I think we should just keep calm and let them get on with the counting.
Right. Well, Andrew, I'm going to show everyone here these tweets from Donald Trump in terms of whether he thinks he's losing or not. He's actually tweeted, rather, "We have claimed for electoral vote purposes the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the state of Georgia and the state of North Carolina, each one of which has a big Trump lead. Additionally, we hereby claim the state of Michigan." Now, then it looks as if Twitter has tried to sort of delete some of this, but it goes on to say, we believe we've won in these areas because there was a large number of secretly dumped ballots, as has been widely reported. Is there any evidence of that, Andrew?
No, there isn't. I mean, the interesting thing is Mr. Trump is digging in. I spoke to somebody last night who'd had a long telephone call with him. He is going to fight this all the way. The interesting thing is who will be on his side. The Republican establishment in Washington is not particularly keen to go down this road. More interestingly, Fox News is not pouring petrol on the flames. Fox News is not running with these tweets and turning them into incendiary coverage. It's one of the reasons he's quite angry about it. These tweets are going out, but even Fox News is not picking them up. Now, look, the Republicans will go along with the president calling for recounts. That happens everywhere. And there are some states where it's so close, there will be recounts. They will also see how the lawsuits go. What is the real grounds for challenging the result in various states? If there are really good grounds, the Republican establishment will stick with the president. If they aren't, they will begin to move back, because this is what they will say. They will say, first of all, We've still got the Senate. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, will be the second most powerful man in Washington, regardless of who is in the White House. We've got the Supreme Court. The Democrats may have won the White House, but it's hardly an amazing victory. Joe Biden's being dragged over the line and just making it. They'll see him as a lame duck president, a one-term president, a president that will have to deal with Mitch McConnell. And here's the deal, as Joe Biden would say. Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell have made deals in Congress and in Washington for decades and decades. So they're not as worried about this as Donald Trump. Donald Trump has his own axe to grind here, and it's not necessarily the same axe as the Republican leadership.
Right. Well, Tom, what do you make of his attempts, Donald Trump, then, to make these challenges, not just recounts, but legal challenges in the courts?
So if he's got evidence, let him bring it. That's how a fair and open legal system works. If he doesn't, then Andrew expressed very clearly a correct opinion, which is that is simply undermining a process. And that, by the way, that's not just me saying it. Mitch McConnell has said it. Marco Rubio has said it. They've said it by saying, keep counting, keep calm.
Right. What's it going to do, though, to a country that's already divided?
Well, that's it. So bitterly divided. Been divided, though, since, of course, pre-Obama times. Again, this is like the Brexit debate, which is, again, the divisions were already there, and we've got all these issues. The key thing to remember is the Republicans were never in love with Donald Trump. He despised them, and they despised him. He was very useful. Once he was winning, once he was the candidate, once he was in power, absolutely happy to play. If they don't think he's going to win any of these challenges, the support is going to slip away and very, very, very quickly, I think.
Caroline?
Look, we've seen an incredible election where the turnout is a record, the highest since 1908. We've seen high turnout, not just through the postal votes, but also people queuing around the block to vote. And it's very close. And should Biden win, and he will have a record vote for that, but Trump will have a record vote as a loser, if you like, if that's how it pans out. And there's a huge number of Americans, middle-of-the-road Americans, not the extremists we often sort of hear and see, but middle-of-the-road Americans who still voted for Trump in this election. He had an increased vote amongst black and minority voters, amongst women, amongst Latinos, amongst Hispanics. He clearly has got a hold still, and he wants to create a story which is about how they have been robbed of the president that they voted for. And how Biden reacts to that, if he should be president, and the Democrats, is going to be really important as to whether we see further polarisation over the next 4 years. It is not a done deal that Trumpism is over.
Right, Alyn, just before I come to you, Andrew, listening to what Caroline has just said, you've talked about some disquiet in Republican circles, but generally they will probably go along with some of the challenges that he is going to embark on. What about Trump's supporters? They still like Trump, don't they?
Yes, I mean, they'll go along with the challenges until they see there's no further road to go. I don't think the Republican leadership wants to drag this out and run the risk of trouble on the streets. I mean, it's a tinderbox America at the moment. There's a very febrile attitude. And if there's a sense that this is only for the benefit of one man in the White House who won't leave, then I think they won't want to drag that out. The key thing about this, other than it looks as if Mr. Biden is going to be the next president, we are not yet sure, but it looks that that's the way it's going, is that this election has not been a repudiation of Trumpism. By any means. The Democratic leadership, the political elite, the media overwhelmingly thought this was going to be a repudiation of Trumpism, and it is not. By no means is it. And this has lessons for the Republican Party going forward and for the Democrats. Elections now in America are not won out on the West Coast. They're not won in the South. They're not won on the East Coast. They're won in the heartland. And to win the heartland, you need a candidate and policies that will appeal to the heartland. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and places like that. Now, Kamala Harris from California, I don't think so. She has very little appeal in that heartland where the Democrats need to win. And although the Republicans in many ways may be glad to see the back of Trump, they will have to choose someone who nevertheless represents a lot of what Trump stood for when it came to blue-collar workers. So the significance of this election for both the parties in America is huge. And in many ways, Mr. Trump may well go and just go and complain and moan, but basically disappear. Mr. Biden is clearly a transition candidate, is an interregnum president. Both parties need to decide how can they position their policies and choose leaders that will appeal to that industrial heartland of the United States, because we now know That is where elections are won and lost.
Right.
Nowhere else.
Right. Well, Alyn, it isn't a repudiation of Trump, is it, this election? Or Trumpism?
No, indeed not.
Trumpism,
I think most of us would have hoped for a much more decisive result, certainly on the Democrat side from my perspective. But I do have faith in the institutions of American democracy. And I think that's the important point that we all need to unite around here. And I think going forward, the question will be the extent to which Biden can build bridges with moderate Republicans and the extent to which the moderate Republicans will either cut Trump loose and treat him as a Nigel Farage fringe figure rather than a Boris Johnson figure at the heart of their government.
Right, but what lessons can be learnt from this, then, when you look at the way the demographics have fallen?
Well, indeed. I mean, the lessons in America and here in Britain. I mean, first in America, I think the lesson needs to be learnt that, you know, your average middle American of whatever ethnicity doesn't really care for diversity politics. They don't care for Black Lives Matters and protests on the streets. They don't want that obsession. But also, I think the other key lessons they learnt, and again, big lesson that needs to be learnt here, it wasn't about the handling of the pandemic, it was about the economy. And I think this is going to be a big lesson for the Conservative Party in the coming years. Got far longer to wait until the general election, of course, 2024. But actually, people are not going to remember so much the people who they didn't know, who very sadly died of this virus, but they are going to remember and know about the business they lost, the job that they lost, and the economic effects and the tax rises in the future. And I think the Labour Party here are going to have to learn the lessons. They, you know, after all of what Donald Trump has done in the last 4 years, after all his failings on the pandemic, all the lies, the impeachment, everything he's done and said, I'm as appalled by as I know many other people are. He's still put on 3 million votes. What does that say? That says that they were not offering a good alternative. Why not? Well, because they don't really get it.
Right, Caroline?
Look, many Democrats find Trump detestable, and I don't carry any torch for the man at all. But the problem with the Democrats is they extend that anger to the people who voted for Trump and almost detest them as much as they detest the president as well. And that has to change. And Andrew's absolutely right. You know, when all's said and done, these presidential elections are decided in those Rust Belt states. It is not East and West Coast. It is those Rust Belt states. And they're deciding this. And Biden, you know, was the right candidate at the right time. It would have been even worse, I think, for the Democrats if they hadn't had Biden at the helm. But the question is how they're going to go forward. How are the Democrats, and the lessons for Labour here, are going to make sure that they don't just retreat to policies that just do not have an appeal to those people in those areas, and not just appeal to them, but actually show that they respect and like those people, that they value those people, that recognise that amongst Trump's voters are middle Americans, white, blue-collar Americans, many of whom used to vote Democrat, and they need to win them back. But they have to do that by showing that actually they do like these people and don't detest them.
Right, but is there a read across here for the Labour Party, Caroline?
Well, there is a read across here because, you know, our vote amongst the white working class has diminished enormously. Across the so-called red wall seats, we lost from people who voted Labour for generations to the Conservatives and to the Brexit Party. And it would be a failure to think that just by talking about left behind communities, about listening, is going to be enough to turn it around. There has to be a sea change in the party in recognising that we will never win a general election if we just rely on the cities and university towns. These towns, these communities are important, and we have to reach out in a way that addresses their concerns that they've raised for many decades now and have came to us ahead in the 2016 referendum and certainly in 2019, the general election. But actually, again, like the Democrats, show that we value these people, that we understand that their reasons for supporting their communities, their family, for patriotism and how that plays out into their daily lives is important and chimes with the values of Labour as well.
All right.
And
well,
so
You've mentioned towns here, Caroline. I want to play this clip from Fox News host Tucker Carlson. I think this was actually just before the election. He has this analysis about Donald Trump's appeal to parts of the country.
They love him anyway. They love Donald Trump because no one else loves them. The country they built, the country their ancestors fought for over hundreds of years, has left them to die in their unfashionable little towns, mocked and despised by the sneering half-wits with finance degrees but no actual skills who seem to run everything all of a sudden.
Do you agree with that sentiment, or do you recognise that sentiment that could also apply here to towns and the so-called levelling up agenda that Boris Johnson talks about?
Yes, it's exactly what I recognise when I go around, or used to travel around towns in the UK. the sort of satellite towns that you find on the edge of major cities, they're not satellites in their own mind. They are proper, bases of industry of the past, places where there were real jobs, but they've become effectively dormitories to places like Manchester and Liverpool, and even, some of the parts where I represent have become dormitories to London. And that evisceration of local pride, that evisceration of identity, of a real place in society, is what has taken away from many people identity. And then to hear identity politics telling people that they're racist because they want to have jobs that actually pay a decent salary, or they're racist because they're anti something because they simply want to have values that they've grown up with respected, is really a bit much,
right?
And that's what we've seen quite a lot of.
Right. Well, the Conservative government has committed to doing something about parts of the country, Alyn, but that's rhetoric. We've yet to see enough evidence of that. What is your response generally to the points that are being made in terms of Trumpism and the read across here?
Well, I'm very struck at the extent to which Scottish politics is different to English politics even, and US politics, and the difference is proportional representation. Structures matter. I mean, we saw this in the 2014 independence referendum, that a lot of people who checked out of the democratic process, feeling that all the parties just didn't really have much to do with them, suddenly had something to vote for. We saw an element of that in the Brexit referendum as well, that a lot of people re-engaged with democracy in order to endorse the change concept. Now, under first past the post, which remains the English democratic system, and it's up to England to decide what it wants to do, but vast amounts of votes are wasted. Vast amounts of people are ignored. In Scotland, for 20-odd years now, we've had proportional representation, which gives a greater plurality of the expression, a greater discourse between the electorate and those who represent the electorate. We're also a smaller country. We've got a more intimate democracy.
All right.
But the left behind is the biggest problem facing US and English politics, that a lot of people feel shut out and ignored by their politicians.
Julia?
I can't tell you how much the British people are crying out right now for a constitution on how to change our voting system. It's the thing that everyone, were we allowed to be in the pubs, would be talking about. What a load of absolute nonsense. Every political party supports the political system, the electoral system that gives them the best chance. It's absolute nonsense. There's a lot to be argued for in the first past the post, clear, decisive answers. This isn't what this is about. This is actually just about a lot of the things. I agree with what Tom had to say, and Caroline as well, that again, you can't tell whether it's America or Britain, you can't tell millions and millions of perfectly good, law-abiding, hard-working citizens that they're nasty and racist, and they have white privilege, and they're responsible for every evil in the world, and the country's terrible, and everything's going to rack and ruin, and isn't it all awful? And then expect them to go, oh yeah, I'll vote for you. It's just not how people are, and it's not that people want to be sold a pup. They don't want to be sold dishonesty, but that's not what they experience in their daily lives, and it's not how men and women relate to each other. It's not how the different classes relate to each other, or indeed how different ethnic groups relate to each other. It's totally out of touch with real people's lives.
It was quite striking, actually, speaking to colleagues who won seats in the so-called Red Wall recently, the number of my new colleagues who've said they spent years hearing from Labour candidates and Labour politicians how awful the community was and how much more money they needed from the centre. And when the Conservative candidate said, look, we can do some of this stuff ourselves, we can stand up on our own 2 feet, and actually we have a lot to be proud of, just that message of personal pride and personal integrity changed a lot.
Caroline?
Well, speaking from Doncaster.
Yeah. Caroline from Doncaster.
Thank you. Yes. Look, I'd just say a couple of things. First of all, on the excerpt you showed from Fox, I think there's a lot of what was said chimes with voters here and why they voted for Brexit. But I also would say, actually, there are some similarities with the support from the SNP in Scotland, with people going to them just in the way people went to the UKIP and the Brexit Party in England. I think part of what helped the SNP was Labour losing in 2010 and having a Conservative government. And the fact the SNP moved more towards Labour policies as well probably helped too. An insurgency created there by many people in Scotland didn't feel that their voices were being represented in Westminster, and with devolution took advantage of that. And I think in England, amongst white working class voters, didn't feel that the parties, and Labour included in that, were speaking to them, were attracted to UKIP and Brexit. Over 20 years, it built and built and built. So these are people who have felt disenfranchised. Nobody's listening to them. Nobody cares. Some people in some quarters, I'm afraid, actively show that they dislike them, which is not great, and blame them, for example, even now, electing a Tory government last December. I see it all the time on social media, ex-Labour voters who voted Conservative being blamed, rather than trying to understand what forced those people to vote Conservative. And just as with Trump, lots of these people don't really like Trump. They see all his failings. They think he's a failed character, a flawed character in many respects. Lots of them think the same about Boris Johnson. But the question is, what do they hear about what is being said to them, about themselves, their communities, and what stands out? And in America, it was America first, stop sending jobs to China, we're going to give people a pay rise. And that's what he did with his tax changes early on. He gave everyone a pay rise, and that made a difference. And this is where people are. They want to hear their concerns being heard, but also their way of life being respected.
Andrew, before we let you go, lessons learned in terms of this election so far?
First of all, let me just say, the SNP gets such a free ride on programmes that come from London. The left behind in Scotland are still left behind as before. The level of poverty and deprivation in the East End of Glasgow is unrepeated anywhere in Western Europe. Male longevity in parts of east of Glasgow are on a par with sub-Saharan Africa. So let's not hear about the left behind. The attainment gap between poor kids and better off kids in Scotland is as wide as it has ever been. Indeed, if you're a poor kid in Scotland, you now got a less of a chance of going to university than a poor kid in England. And historically, that's never happened before. So whether you got PR or not doesn't really help you if you're left behind. The overall lesson I would take from the United States, which is true for Western Europe and the United Kingdom and America, is politicians need to decide where elections are going to be won or lost. I've explained where they're now being won or lost in America. In Britain, they are not won or lost in the cities. They're Labour, no matter where the cities are. They're not won or lost in the posh counties. They are Conservative. They are won or lost in the provincial towns, small towns, rural areas, areas that feel left behind. And if you want to win an election now, you better have a candidate that will appeal to these people and not just appeal to your base.
Well, we never like to give anyone a free ride, but Alyn, I must let you come back and respond, if you want, to what you heard.
I think you're obliged to. Andrew really has had a long shift over there in the States and really could do with a well-deserved lie down. His frustration that the SNP keeps winning is
I'm sitting in
going
London.
through there. Well, you just patronised me terribly there. The SNP is winning the centre ground of Scottish politics because we have made the case that we need more powers to deal with the issues that we are dealing with. And we've got an election coming up in May where we're putting our candidates together just now. We're putting our manifesto together. And it'll be for the people of Scotland to decide how best we are governed and how best our constitutional future is represented. And the problem Scotland has, we don't shy away from, but we need all the tools to fix them.
All right, Andrew?
There's not a single tool that you need to solve poverty in the East End of Glasgow that you don't already have. You're entirely in charge of the education system. You control the education system in Scotland, and yet the attainment gap between rich and poor kids has got wider. So it's not a matter of power, it's a matter of policy and giving it priority to make sure that a country like Scotland, which has always prided itself in poor kids getting a decent education, lives up to its historic record and not what's happening now.
All right, well, we started to talk about US politics. We've ended in Scotland there. Andrew, thank you for joining us today. A marathon few days covering the presidential election for the BBC.
My new freedom as well to say what I think.
Yeah.
We love it too.
I heard that muttering. This could be your last appearance on Politics Live, but as far as I'm concerned, you're welcome back any time. So it's goodbye for now. Take care.
Good luck, Joe, to you and to all the wonderful team at Politics Live. It's such a great programme.
Thank you very much. Well, they'll all be watching and they'll appreciate that from you, Andrew. Now, I said we would return to the issue of lockdown, which has started in England, and that the Chancellor had been making a statement. I don't know if we can now hear a bit from Rishi Sunak talking about the furlough scheme.
So we can announce today that the furlough scheme will not be extended for 1 month. It will be extended until the end of March. The government will continue to help pay people's wages up to 80% of the normal amount. All employers will have to pay for hours not worked is the cost of employer NICs and pension contributions. We'll review the policy in January to decide whether economic circumstances are improving enough to ask employers to contribute more.
What's your reaction? Relief?
Well, I'm very glad he's done it. I'm very glad that Rishi has given many businesses at least the knowledge that they'll be able to get through till March. And I think this is, one of those moments where the government has really got to share the burden across the entire United Kingdom. And I'm very glad that he's made that step.
Right, Alyn, listening to that, because the SNP have been asking repeatedly about what this actually means for Scotland. Now, Boris Johnson, as you know, said earlier in the week that it would be UK-wide. What perhaps wasn't completely clear was whether or not the SNP in Scotland could have a furlough scheme at 80% compensation whenever they need it, as they see it. Are you clear now?
No, there's a lot of detail still to come through in this statement. As I said earlier, there's a number of people will remain excluded from the support that's been announced. Now, I welcome the support. I appreciate things are being made on the hoof because the situation is evolving. But look at how Germany's dealt with it. There was a clear extension of the furlough well into 2021 to give everyone the certainty that they need. This has been made up on the hoof, left, right and centre, conflicting messages. There is a devolution settlement that needs to be respected. So we do want to see this tracking through to the Scottish numbers as well. But it really is telling that it's only when the southeast of England was looking at lockdown that we've seen serious Treasury attention onto this. Now, we want to work with the UK government to keep as many businesses safe as we can. This is tough times and we all need to work together. But the fact is that UK Treasury really has not looked after the interests of Wales, Scotland, Northern England, or indeed Northern Ireland.
All right, well, look, before I ask Caroline and Julia, but let's get some clarity on what Rishi Sunak has been talking about in terms of some of the detail. We can talk to Adam Fleming, BBC's newscast presenter. Adam, what do we know?
Yeah, so Rishi Sunak's just been announcing that the furlough scheme will be extended till the end of March. The government will guarantee people's wages up to 80%, and employers will have to contribute national insurance contributions and pension contributions, which on average is about 5%. And I think what is interesting here is that Rishi Sunak is delinking government support for wages from any kind of restrictions on individual areas and also from geography. This will be in place until the end of March and will apply to firms that need it, irrespective of what restrictions are actually applied by whatever government on those businesses. Also, a lot of emphasis from Rishi Sunak in his statement in Parliament just now about not necessarily restrictions, but just the generally bad economic picture and the fact that the economy is suffering irrespective of restrictions. It's suffering because of the existence of the virus.
Julia?
I have to say, I think everyone's being far too cheery about this. I think everyone's under the illusion there are all these businesses that are just going to be sitting there, no problem, no fixed costs whatsoever. And OK, oh great, everyone's wages are being paid up to 80%. And just a little bit of small matter of national insurance and pensions. These are thousands of pounds a year that employers are going to have to pay. Even with the 80% furlough, it's up to a maximum of about £30,000 and average income. A lot of families, maybe one income earner, they've got a big mortgage, 2 kids. How on earth are they going to survive on 80% of that? This is the reality. Is those jobs may still exist for a while, but do the businesses for which they work still exist? November is one of the most crucial months for the entire year for most retailers, for leisure, for an awful lot of the bars and restaurants. They're going to lose all of that money, and from early December and most of the way through December as well. The reality is an awful lot of those jobs simply will not exist in a few months' time. And this furlough scheme, as generous as it may well be, is not the same as allowing people to go about their business, to make money and to sell their custom.
Do you agree with that, Caroline?
Well, of course, I do welcome the extension of the furlough scheme and the reassurances about the amounts. There are lots of other people in different categories who will still be asking questions. But the fact is that when the furlough scheme was cut by the Chancellor, jobs were lost. Then he had to incentivise employers to hold people on. It's been pretty unedifying as well, the regional and national debates about us in the north trying to get the support we need from government. And it does appear, rightly or wrongly, that only when London and the South East are brought into the frame, suddenly do these matters get resolved. So it hasn't been a great time, and the stops and starts in this is completely unhelpful. Where I would agree with Julia is, regardless of how generous a scheme is and support for employers, we are going through a devastating time in terms of our economy, in terms of those businesses that may still shut down and never reopen, and employers who are letting people go, and we've heard more of it today, who will never actually re-employ those people or new workers again.
Right.
The time has come for actually a really important discussion about how we're going to rebuild our economy when we come out of this pandemic, and it's got to be different from before.
All right,
it's got to be one that speaks to the whole country.
Right, well, let's get a sort of personal take from a businessman in the way that Caroline and Julia have described. Ricky Wilson of Group 10 Executive Coaches joins us from Newcastle. But, Ricky, the reason we got in touch with you is because the Labour MP Tugendhat asked a question about your coach company, which is in her constituency. Tell us about your situation. Are you getting the help you need?
No, we're far from getting the help that we need. I've just listened to Sunak's announcement today, and the furlough scheme extension is always very welcome to me and many businesses, but simply without support for other areas of our businesses to maintain overheads, we can't then implement the furlough scheme, because ultimately if there's no business to pay or support the furlough scheme, then there is no furlough scheme really. So we need support from the government that's going to help with our overheads, and we need obviously that support in form of grants. We've already lent vast amounts of money that ultimately has to be paid back. So all we're doing is constantly pushing a problem further and further forward. And the coach industry specifically has had very, very little support apart from the furlough scheme and access to a bounce back loan scheme. And the CBILS facility is just inaccessible. Very few people have had access to it. We just cannot gain access to it.
Right, Tom?
Look, Ricky's absolutely right. We need to get the loan facility in. We need to get the rates holiday, the business rates holiday that we had before. And we need to make sure that businesses are going concern, because Julia's absolutely right. The only way the economy is going to be paid for is by, the only way public services are going to be paid for is by having a growing economy. And we need to get back to work as soon as possible. The government has asked for 28 days to see if they can turn around the current rise in cases, and to make sure that the health service is on a reasonable footing for the heart of winter, really. Mm-hmm. We've given them that, begrudgingly, but we've given them that. They've now got to sort it out. They've got to sort out not only the support for businesses, but they've also got to sort out making sure that we don't have to close down the economy again. We need an ongoing strategy.
You don't have to close down the economy now.
That's a matter of some debate, and I spoke to various people in my own constituency about it. I have to say it was a marginal call. But the reality is that the government has been pretty clear that that's what they need. Yeah. And they have now got permission to do it. What they now need to do is to use these 28 days, because these 28 days are not going to come back. We need to make sure that by the time we get to the 2nd of November, we actually have a plan that keeps the economy going and manages the spread of the virus.
So you say it's begrudging, your support for this lockdown. When it comes to the 2nd of December, you won't give the government your support again if they try and extend it?
It's very hard to see a situation in which that would be appropriate, because either this lockdown has worked, in which case we're in a better position than we were, or it hasn't, in which case lockdowns don't work, in which case we need a new strategy anyway. So either way, we need a new strategy.
Right. Ricky, can your business survive another month or so in this situation?
I very much doubt it now, because apart from the furlough scheme, and with no access to grants or even being able to lend any more money, my finance payments that I've been on payment support now for coming up to month 9, because we were affected ahead of the lockdown because of the type of work we do income and tourism. The amount of debt that's built up to date is over £355,000. We can't get access to any of the CBILS lending facilities, and we've been excluded from being leisure or tourism. So we physically cannot get any grants. Me personally, I don't have my own premises. As you can see, I run my business from home, which means we don't qualify for any of the grants because we don't pay business rates.
Right. Ricky, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again over the next few weeks or so to see how you're managing. Adam, can you give us some more detail about the rules? Because new guidance has come out in terms of care homes.
Yeah, so this is from the Department of Health in England, saying that care home visits for relatives should be facilitated. It's really important that people can see their loved ones, but it has to be done in a COVID-secure way. And they've proposed some ideas. Do you have floor-to-ceiling screens in rooms? Do you have relatives coming to the window or meeting their loved ones outside in the garden or outside the care home. Some charities saying this just isn't going to work because what about people who are bedbound? What about people who've got dementia, who just won't be able to handle that weird way of seeing their relatives? Some care homes just saying, well, how are we going to put these facilities in place now, especially now that there's a lockdown in England? And as we've learned throughout the pandemic, the care system is a fragmented system. So some people in some areas with some care homes might have a very different experience from people in other areas.
Right, Adam, thank you very much. Just because we've only got a few minutes left, I'm going to show you this clip from a film last night that was on the 10 o'clock news about an incident in Yorkshire. Just take a look at this.
So let's just make this very clear. My nan, my 97-year-old nan here, who we have taken from the care home because we haven't seen her for 9 months, is now being taken back by force to her care home. My mother has been arrested. My mother is in the back of the car here. She is a nurse. She is a fully qualified nurse who is wishing to care for her own mother. And here we have an incredible use of police time to take my 97-year-old grandmother back into a care home where she is deteriorating, where we haven't been able to see her for 9 months. Nan, I love you and we are going to fight for you.
Now, that was a very emotional account of a story that happened there in Yorkshire. The police were called by the care home because the care home has a legal duty of care for the grandmother there who is their resident, and that is why they called the police. Caroline and Alyn, what did you make of that, and what now do you think the guidance should be on care homes? Caroline first.
I think it was dreadful, and just the handling of that situation just seemed to be completely over the top. Look, lots of us have been affected by the fact we haven't been able to see our older relatives, and lots of us have lost them and not seen them when they died. And up and down the country, there's such huge variation about what the care homes are doing. There has to be a better way on this, and I can't for the life of me in that situation, given I understand the family went through every other avenue to try and see their relative and bring that relative home.
Right.
Why something more can't be done. And I'm afraid, you know, these are situations that the government should have a grip on. It shouldn't be just producing something now at the end of a terrible year. All
right, I'll come back to Tom in just a moment. Alyn, just to say, by the way, the woman who was arrested was released.
It's a terribly sad video. I saw it, and it was one of those. The police weren't wrong. The care home wasn't wrong. The family isn't wrong. It's a dreadful situation. I have to say, in Scotland, we're not in lockdown, and what we're producing is 5 levels of protection, where different restrictions will be in place in different places, and we are working on new guidelines for care homes as well.
Although Scotland suffered very much in terms of infection rates through the last wave, didn't you, in terms of COVID in care homes in Scotland?
It has been dreadful, and that's why we need to keep care homes really on our radar as places that are vulnerable, and we need to make sure that the restrictions, tight as they are, sadly, are very, very necessary. But obviously we need to take due note of the needs of family and indeed the needs of the patients as well in terms of issues that aren't about COVID. So it's a really tough situation, and nobody's got the answers.
I spoke to the woman who made the video, Leandra, on my show this morning, and she and her mother have been going in every single day until the lockdown, feeding the grandmother with dementia. It's not just wrong and sad, it's disgusting, it's inhumane. It's not what we should be doing in this country. The government's new guidelines on how care homes should operate suggest to me that not a single person who drew those guidelines up has ever been in a care home.
Tom?
Well, look, I think that we've got a huge problem here that we've got to manage, and it requires conversation between the care homes and the families.
Shouldn't that have happened already?
Well, it should be happening, and by the way, in good care homes, it is happening. I can tell you about one in the area I'm privileged enough to represent, where that is exactly what's happening, and they are managing very difficult circumstances, but they are managing it by discussing it with families and indeed with the wider family group, so to make sure that others aren't disadvantaged. But the idea that there are some areas that are doing brilliantly and others that are doing badly, look, I'm afraid, you know, there had to be a vote in the Scottish Parliament yesterday to force an inquiry into care homes that the SNP tried to resist. We've got to make sure that we don't get to that stage and that we're actually open and able to have that conversation here and now.
This just isn't a country we should want to live in.
All right, that's all we've got time for. We're back on Monday at 12:15.